colleague Carmen Chavez from University of New Mexico, and we're chairing and then moderating the panel. So thank you so much for coming. I'm going to give you a little bit of background about how we got here, and then Carmen's going to introduce a previous panel with some context, and then our esteemed guests. So thank you all for showing up. I'm excited to hear what we have to say. Carmen and I began working on a couple of projects several years ago. One of them was a special issue for women's studies and communication, and we were looking at questions of power, feminism, and how that does or doesn't fit for us as communication scholars. And actually, it was Carmen who realized that at the moment we were beginning to have these conversations, it had been about 21 years since we had the original panel where many of these same scholars asked the question, what distinguishes or ought to distinguish feminist communication scholarship? And so we thought, what a great idea to try to bring together those voices again and also add some new voices into the mix. And so through a lot of conversation and planning, we were able to bring together, like I said, some of those voices at the last WSCA and then this panel here today. And our guiding questions really are for us as feminist scholars to take a look at where we've been, what are we proud about, what are we troubled about, and then where might we want to go or should we go as feminist scholars. And so those are the guiding questions that we asked our panelists to address today.
So, like Sadie said, this is part two. We did the first one at Western States Communication last February, and at that time we had the following people were there: Jan Buto, Marlene Fine, Karen Foss, and Sonia Foss from the original panel in 1988 in Special Issue of Women's Studies and Communication. And then we also brought in new voices, and so we brought in Michelle Hawley, Bernadette Hallenfeld, Shanaira Reed Brinkley, and myself. And so that was that panel last year. And then we tried to get everybody else who was on the original panel, and we didn't succeed, but we're very happy with who we have this time around. And different voices too. And different voices too, which is what we wanted to do, is to bring in sort of the original folks who are part of that special issue, and then voices who weren't a part, but are forging new directions in communication studies and feminism now. So I'll introduce you to the panelists here. We have Brenda Allen from University of Colorado, Denver, in the center here. We have Celeste Condit from University of Georgia, here on the left. We have Cerise Glenn, who's now at University of North Carolina, Greensboro. It says Purdue, but that's where she's at now, down on the end there. We have Sarah McKinnon from University of New Mexico, right here in the end. We have Shane T. Morman, our lone man, in the center here from California State University, Fresno. And then we have Julia Wood from University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And as Cindy mentioned, we really just posed the question, what distinguishes and ought to distinguish feminist communication scholarship? Oh, yes, and I forgot to mention, Radha Hegde, who's not here because she didn't register, was also supposed to be a part of the panel, but she had some family issues, so she couldn't be here. But we wanted to be sure to acknowledge that she's a part of the conversation, too. So if it's all right with the panelists, I think we'll just go down the list. We're going to be sitting over there. We're hoping to give you about 5 to 7 minutes. So I'll do old school speech and debate, 2 minutes to go, 3 minutes to go. If you could start wrapping it up, that'd be cool. That's what that means. Okay. Thank you all for being here.
First. That's kind of good. Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
It's a little better. I am very pleased to be part of this, what I hope will be more of a discussion than a presentation. I'm glad that I'm first because I can throw a lot of things on the table. How these things often work is by the time you get to the 5th or 6th person, they're like, well, what she said. So I get to say a few things. And I actually have several things that I would like to share with you, but I think what I'll do instead is just throw out a couple of issues that I think in particular we should be thinking about. I believe that in terms of feminist studies and communication, we've made lots of progress. And I think we see evidence of that progress, for instance, by just looking around the room and visibly the kind of cues in terms of who's in the room, whether it has to do with perceptions of race, ethnicity, of age, of a sense of where you are perhaps in your academic career. I think that's very exciting. When I was at Legislative Assembly yesterday, one of the things that happens is the editors of the various journals for the organization give reports in terms of the kinds of articles they published, the kinds of people who, the gender of the people who published articles. And I noticed that in terms of those who gave reports, at just about every journal there were some that said the topic was feminism. What I did notice, however, is that, can you guess which publication had the most in terms of having articles about feminism in it, in terms of our journals? Can you guess which one? Well, that's actually not through NCA. So these were NCA publications.
TPQ.
No. No. No.
QJS.
QJS. Which I think is interesting. And I don't want to, of course, you have to think about the process by which articles get published and so forth, but immediately something that I hope we aim for is that we see feminist-oriented articles in all of our journals, because the journals are such a key place where people learn about issues, where people decide whether or not, what kinds of scholars they want to be and so forth. So I think that I want to put that on the table as something that we might aim for. And also, as I think about QJS and the types of articles it probably publishes as contrasted with the Journal of Applied Communication Research, I think there's also room there for a recommendation I have in terms of really working towards how do we get more praxis in terms of feminist research and scholarship, teaching, and so forth. So Jacker had one article in terms of the articles it published over the year. I think there was one that it said feminist. This was not a systematic research. This is just me eyeballing, here's what they're reporting. So I wonder if I looked at the article, if, what does even feminism mean to that? So that's one thing I would offer. Related to that is just the idea of becoming much more proactive and much more concerted in our efforts to make sure the work we're doing in feminist studies and communication gets out into a variety of communities, gets out in terms of, oftentimes I know some other units in various organizations will do community work, will do, even as part of the conference experience. And I don't know if we've done anything like that, particularly with the division, but really the main point I want to make is just I see a need for us to really to extend what we're doing in terms of the implications of what's going on in the world. There's so many talking heads on television, for example, when things happen in the world. Imagine feminist communication scholars weighing in on so many of the issues that matter. So those are some of the things that I would recommend. The last point I want to throw on the table for conversation is that we have talked a lot about intersectionality, about looking, when we talk about gender issues, that we look also at, for example, race, ethnicity, social class, sexuality. And I think we've made progress, especially in terms of, at least in written work or presentations, people at least talking about maybe if there was a group they studied, then they give a nod to there were more of a variable analytic approach, kind of the demographics. Or as looking at a particular group, for instance, looking at African American women and talking about feminist issues for African American women, I think there's room even within those where you focus on a particular group of women to deepen the idea of intersectionality and of thinking about how within groups we are heterogeneous. And finally, specifically with intersectionality, I was working with a doctoral student on another campus who's developed a survey. And the survey, I won't go into the details of the survey because I really want to get to my primary point, which is she contended that she was studying intersectionality through her project. And as I looked at the proposal and as I looked at the theory she was applying and so forth, I asked her, well, how are you getting at intersectionality? And she said, well, I'm asking them their gender, their race, their class. And I said, okay, and once you know that, where will you take that? So I think we need to really be much more mindful, we need to find or generate models for what do we mean by intersectionality? How are we really studying that? What implications do we think that has for our scholarship as feminists? Thank you.
I'm going to stand up both in the hopes that I can see you through these lights, and hopefully the lights will get a little bit more out of my way. And I'm also going to start this watch, so hopefully I know where I can't start the watch. Okay. So I want to do this in the kind of now standard feminist way by talking, about myself, which can be a little tutu. But I really am trying now to kind of push the agenda of having communication scholars think more about the intersection of the individual and the social, that intersection, and which is a different kind of intersection. And I do think my experience of NCA and feminism has been exactly as Brenda says, that we have made a ton of progress, which is not to say we don't have a lot more work to do, or y'all have a lot more work to do. But I do want to say this by kind of thinking about where that first panel was. And I was, I think I was either a first-year professor or a grad student. I can't even remember. But I was so incredibly ignorant. And I had come to feminism for utterly personal reasons that I didn't want to not be able to do. I mean, that's why I came to feminism. And nobody's going to tell me I can't, right? And feminism was the place that said, that's right, And but that's all I knew, And over the years, what I have learned, and I've just learned wave after wave of the different kinds of expansions of feminism, I've learned that I can't get out of my own standpoint. I mean, it's here. But I can expand the kind of range that gets included, both in what I can see and in what I can feel, and that I can have just a little bit more humility that without giving up the sense that it's about me, So I think one of the challenges for feminism in increasing the study of intersectionality is that we often come to feminism individually with really strong needs and a lot that we expect out of it. And whichever position you're from that you came to feminism in this room, those things are really strong. And so it's very hard in certain kinds of ways to credit the needs of others. You see that as a threat to your own needs. And, the Fosses and I probably had some good arguments coming out of the different sense of needs and the ways to resolve those needs. And over time, I've become much more convinced that each of us don't have to give up our needs in trying to build ways for other people to meet those needs. And I think discursively we've constructed feminism in ways that now allow us to do that, not just for us individually. So where that leaves me now, after lots and lots of learning, being told that I was ignorant about all kinds of things that I was indeed ignorant about, is that I still have trouble coming up with a definition of feminism in relationship to naming feminism as such in a way that deals with the men problem. And this has always been a problem for me. And so I'm going to give a definition that we were asked to give definitions of feminism that risks making feminism sound subordinate But I don't think it does, partly because I think feminism has been a key core of this throughout, but also, again, respects that feminism hasn't been the only core throughout. And so I want to define feminism as one of the names for the project of building a world where positive emotions can flourish for everyone. And I think that this requires that humans nourish the beings around them, and they nourish each other as we grow in a lot of different directions. And that includes artistic, moral, intellectual, relational, and other directions that I can't think of. And that definition, by saying feminism is only one of, some people can interpret that as meaning it's not the center, which it may not be the center, but we're kind of over the center thing. And that it could be dispensed with. But that's not true, because each of the projects that contribute, that has different names and different streams that contribute to that set of goals, is essential to it, or necessary. If that word essential, so we all still get nervous about. It's necessary to that. And so I want to say that as feminism is one of the necessary, important, crucial names for that project of building a world where positive emotions can flourish for everyone. And so the second question we were asked is, what does that mean in terms of scholarship? Well, what I'm trying to do right now as a scholar is to write a theory that is a practice. And I think we're getting better as an association in actually recognizing, because all theories are situated, they all have to be practices that extend beyond the walls of the academy, whether at conferences or universities or whatever. Anyway, to write a theory that's a practice of pathos, and that expands theory, but expands our emotions to take on things that we haven't previously understood as part of emotion. And I don't want to go through all this because I don't think this is the time or place, but I do think there's been this history of association of women with emotion and the domination of men as the rational. And there's this big turn to the emotion in the academy, but in many ways that turn to the emotion is being one more time sucked into the rational world model, and even by women. I just read Ray Toreda's book, Feeling and Theory, and I'm like, oh, this is so sad to me. So I want us to promote the expansion of positive emotion, and so that's what I'm working on. So the last question is what ways that enactment contributes to feminism and feminist communication scholarship. And, I don't know. That's for others to all work out. But I do think women have always taken seriously emotion. And I think we can maybe together be more free to take it seriously than we have, even within the academy. Because one of the things in thinking through what emotion is, emotion is not the irrational, the non-rational, the opposite of reason. Emotion is the way in which we embody reason fully with life. And so if we can see that, I think we will be able to talk about the things that we talk about as feminists, talk about practices and text and so on, not completely different, but with foregrounding that sense of care and relationship and so on, and to see that as academic, but as kind of differently looking academic practice. So that's kind of a nutshell journey, and I hope that other people can share with me as I'm able to try to share the struggles over what the heck do we mean when we articulate intersectionality and so on with Brenda. So thanks.
Good morning.
Morning.
As Brenda J. and Celeste mentioned, both mentioned intersectionality, and I want to talk briefly about how I come to this discussion as a newer scholar coming into the field. I also came into intersectionality from a very different point of view. I didn't come in looking to become a feminist. My background is in organizational communication and intercultural communication, and as I began looking at women of color, in processes, I started to notice that some of the frames we had weren't really capturing the voices of women in ways that I thought they should be articulated. And that's how I came into feminism a little bit later into my graduate school work. As I study women of color, I'll talk primarily about black women. And as Brenda J. mentioned, this call to look at women as being more heterogeneous in this deepening discussion and analysis of who women of color are. And we've come a long way, so to say just thank you, say tribute to the women who have done this work before me and to pay that legacy forward as we continue. For example, the piece that Marsha Houston wrote in '88 about what makes scholarship about black women in communication, feminist communication scholarship. And you have these pieces that come out, and later she and Olga Davis edited a book called Centering Ourselves, African American Feminist and Womenist Studies of Discussion, where you're moving women of color to the center of their own analysis, where instead of talking about women of color, you're sharing their stories from their perspective and that point of view, which really gets a different perspective of how women of color live their lives. From a point of view where you're not looking at, there's black people who also some of them are women, or there's women and some of them may be black or of color. And some of the themes that come through that are looking at multiple consciousness, this value of sisterhood and community, and this culture of resistance. And later work by with Brenda J. and Karen Ashcraft actually looked at organizational communication scholarship and talks about how we've moved gender into some of these frames, but we haven't yet moved race into some of these frames. And so as we're continuing, the younger, newer scholars, so to speak, that are new to this field are coming into it to answer what I consider these calls that some of these women have put out and how we can do that in our work. And one of the things I would like to see intersectionality do, and I'm trying to embed in my own research agenda, is looking at how these notions of race and gender, and also adding in more notions of class, socioeconomic status, sexuality, in ways where they're also foregrounded. But by doing that, and from centered from the perspective of African American women, can do so where we show these notions of who we are as identity aren't fixed or static. They're very dynamic, and as they intersect and as they change, they shift. And we constantly construct and co-construct, negotiate and renegotiate who we are as we go through our lives and organizations and through our cultural selves. So what I would like to do in terms of focusing on, and primarily focus on looking at African American women and anticipatory career socialization and their sense of intergroup differences, is this notion of class being like double jeopardy is looking at race and gender, triple jeopardy being race, class, and gender, and this notion that class being of lower socioeconomic status, that somehow that puts us a little further from the center, but as we move up, that somehow we're close to that norm. I really want to problematize that notion, because what I've noticed in my research, and I did my dissertation where I interviewed 50 African American women who had gone through two different types of institutions. I was looking at historically black colleges and universities and predominantly white institutions, but as they're using education to answer the call from the civil rights movements of education and kind of moving our culture forward and becoming educated, what that has done for their sense of self and who they are. And one of the things I've noticed is doing that research is that as they're obtaining their advanced degrees and becoming more answering in that call and moving themselves forward, they also found themselves renegotiating who they are as women. They find themselves being seen as less feminine, and this notion of who they are as black. They're renegotiating their blackness. Whereas, and the term that kept coming up is now I'm bougie, or now I'm doing these things. Where this notion, yes, bourgeois, yes.
For those of you.
Yes, and so what they're finding is these communities of sisterhood, a sister of African American women and other people of color, and these safe spaces they've used as cultural resistance no longer are accepting them in the same ways. And there's very static, not static, very dynamic in terms of how they're seeing themselves now, not just by the socioeconomic status, but how they're having to renegotiate femininity and their sense of who they are as African American women as they're trying to move forward in terms of socioeconomic status and in their career paths. And what that separation has done is those spaces are very, very important for women, and now they're finding themselves a bit marginalized from those spaces, and particularly in family, friends, and romantic connections. And of particular interest, and a colleague and I are working on a similar project that looks at images in film, is that these are happening within African American communities. It's not just looking at images that somebody else is projecting onto us. Right? These are discussions that are coming from within these safe spaces and communities. And you have young women who are actually questioning, is it worth the sacrifice to get this advanced degree? And some of the things that they have said is that as they're increasing their socioeconomic status, they're losing their ability to marry, assuming that they're straight women who want to marry other African American men, or they're losing that ability to connect to other people in their communities, and finding that they either have to separate that or somehow try to reconcile how they feel about themselves and their private lives and their public lives. So as we move forward with that research and again, answering that call of how we can deepen this analysis and further that analysis, is to look at those intergroup dynamics from the perspective of women of color, and to talk about how they are adaptive, their adaptive behaviors as they're continuing to negotiate and renegotiate across their lives, who they are as women, who they are as people of color, and as other aspects of their identity, such as socioeconomic status and class, impacts that negotiation as they continue. Thank you.
Good morning.
Good morning.
The purpose of this panel was to evaluate what now distinguishes feminist communication scholarship. And while I might say that examinations of narrative, identity, discourse, rhetoric, and meaning-making distinguish what communication studies brings to feminist scholarship, I want to take us in a different direction, to remember what we ought to be mindful of in our scholarship. Today, I want us to think about how we might cultivate a transnational attentiveness in our studies, both those texts or unit of analyses that are undoubtedly wrapped up in transnational relations, as well as those phenomenon that appear on the surface to be bounded to the national scene. This suggestion of what we as feminist communication scholars ought to do is not intended to add yet another intersecting link to the chain of already complicated intersections that inform our work. Rather, I bring up this to suggest that our units of analyses are never merely what they appear to be on the surface. And likely, these texts are bound up in national imaginaries and global economic, political, and cultural relations. Specifically, we must take seriously that, as Rakeshome explains, the in-between slash between the national and the international is precisely the volatile and anxious site upon and through which gender relations are being violently and often unrecognizably reconstituted in globalization. Shome calls us here to question what exists as invisible constitutive players in the gendered relations that we study. At a time like this, when pharmaceuticals that we ingest, contraceptives, vaccines, antibiotics, and antidepressants, are tested on third world subjects to make sure they are fit for Western consumption, at a time when global migrations of people are happening but being policed heavily militarily by state officials, and when middle-class U.S. Americans see the value of Made in America, but not in their everyday consumption practices, I believe we have a ripe moment and an urgent necessity to examine the transnational and global players that shape the identities, consumption practices, meaning-making, and political viability of the people we study with. Transnational attentiveness means paying attention to the historical and contemporary relationships between states, to the ironies and idiosyncrasies of global economic flows, and to the ways transnational subjects get positioned in various national imaginaries. Recognizing these players in our works and our texts is often very challenging and tedious, for very often the transnational is not very obvious on the surface of the text that we interrogate. Rather, these geopolitical, global capital, and global governance systems exist as silent partners in the discourses we interrogate. They exist, to follow Rakeshome's explanation, in the spaces between the inter and national, in the borders, in the export processing zones, the digital signals, and wireless waves. Importantly, this literal silence does not mean that these elements are rhetorically insignificant. Quite the contrary. Future feminist studies in communication must read these silences not as absences, but as unmarked, discursively significant characteristics that our analyses should bring to the surface. While global and geopolitical relations have been mostly located outside of the purview of communication studies, when looking at discursive formations in their broadest sense, as in assemblages of articulated and unarticulated fragments, it becomes clear that these factors, both explicit and not, profoundly shape the communicative situations that compel our work. Our task, then, in taking transnationality seriously, is to illuminate that what exists discursively in the spaces between texts, between words that shape gendered relations and subjectivities. 10 years ago, Radha Hegde called us to start seeing a view from elsewhere, from the transnational that is already always present in the texts and lives and issues we study. I'll end today with her words because I find that call from a decade ago still resonant with the work that we ought to do in feminist communication studies scholarship. In a world, and this is a quotation, in a world that increasingly can be understood only in relational terms, it seems clear that our research can no longer be conceptualized in insular and cultural bound terms. It is important to think of this alliance within feminist communication scholarship between feminism and communication studies as a location from where to speak at a global moment. There are serious issues of oppression and marginality that affect the core of women's lives globally. And it is essential for feminist scholars in communication to find theoretical vantage points from where to speak. The goal is not to etch clean lines of pure theory, but rather to build coalitions and alliances, to gain theoretical momentum in order to represent alterity. Thank you.
I'm sorry that my phone went off. It's on silent, but my partner has set it up to where his text always comes through. So, and it's sweet, sort of. I know it sounds like a fire alarm. So I'm sorry about that. Hi, I'm Shane Mormon, and I'm in the Department of Communication at California State University, Fresno. I'm really honored to be here and sitting with such distinguished scholars, and sitting with scholars I have yet to meet, and scholars that I consider friends. And when I first prepared for this presentation, I told myself, okay, don't show up trying to pick a fight. And something about me is that I am very subversive, and that's why I got into the academy, and that's why I actually love these scholars that are sitting right here, because they're subversive as well. And how that sometimes works against me is that people feel angry whenever I subvert them, and even though it's out of love for their scholarship. So my presentation is also linked to intersectionality. Out of the often silenced or ignored Latino and queer positionality, I'm interested in the intellectually intimate acquaintance with feminism, queer studies, and performance. Importantly, feminism for me forefronts personal accounts as important for theorizing the world. And in an ever-renewing world, we have to be forever mindful of new and critical methodologies into studies of communication that demonstrate how meaning-making is central to our lives, and therefore the meanings we make from the corpus of our academic work should be central to our academic lives. And however, while being mindful of new forms of intellect, we still need to be highly attentive to how contemporary meaning-making is not without its historical backdrop. So I'm providing the historical backdrop of feminism as I see it and as it has landed me in the academy. For me, the most important historical backdrop lies with the intertwining history of women's studies and feminist studies. As women's studies became part of the university disciplinary layout, feminism managed to validate embodied knowledge for the academy. And as feminist studies made corporeal knowing integral, they also held performing bodies, and I tend to think of communication as performance, they held performing bodies accountable for the enactments of activist practice. Women's studies is so great because it holds students and professors accountable to activism, saying, what are you actually going to do? What's the result? And as women's studies was becoming institutionalized, feminist studies were there talking about how important the body is and corporeal knowledge is. And they began to intertwine. So feminism changed the discipline of performance studies in that it asked performers to reimagine purpose as well as to reimagine what stood as performance. They embodied disenfranchised groups to reread themselves, ourselves, into canonical texts. While these rereadings may have dystopic pangs, they offer still optimistic fulfillment. In these rereadings, we can envision a queer future as we abstract a queer past from texts that may or may not have acknowledged our presence. And this possibility of queer rereading offers hope, a hope that can be performed on stages and in activist locales, and perhaps most importantly, a hope that can be performed in our daily lives. As such, I search for scholars who are interdisciplinary in nature as well as global in thought in their approach to cultural identity and intensive explication of identities in between within our globalized times. And so, of course, I come to Gloria Anzaldúa. And she says, about her, the performance of mestizaje. Gloria Anzaldúa is, of course, as you well know, she's interested in the idea of the mestizaje. The performance of mestizaje itself has become a realized signifier of cultural difference, setting a productive space for reinterpreting colonization and the logics of its power structure in certain post-colonial sites. And so my twist on mestizaje is in my queering in opposition to the normativity of whiteness. Gloria Anzaldúa, the queer Latina feminist author of Borderlands, La Frontera, and co-editor of This Bridge Called My Back, has influenced critical scholarship within the communication field and across disciplines and helps me to land here. And when Anzaldúa speaks of a borderland and una conciencia mestiza, she's speaking in a queer tongue through a queer body, chiasmically so. Additionally and importantly, she is speaking in the feminine form of Spanish. And as Alicia Arizon notes, in contrast to Foucault, whose analysis of sexuality is limited by his failure to address the gendered and racialized body, Anzaldúa has constructed a theoretical framework where racialized desire and sexuality can be mapped. For Anzaldúa, racialized gender and gendered race is utilized in order to confront the universality of masculinity. And then Judith Butler maintains that we have quite a mission to refigure the masculine universal in all its corresponding positionalities. And she says this struggle to do this is in language. That is, it's inseparable from the struggle of bodies, and that the task of writing one's way into the future is not a luxury, but the very name of sexual and cultural survival. And as Butler notes, producing change and universality gains its meaning from the details of the body, in motion, in relation, reconstituting life against the grain and against the odds. Living the words of Anzaldúa that may or may not, we all may or may not have read, to survive the borderlands, you must live sin fronteras. And that legitimates non-normative desires through our own illegitimate border crossings and gives us all pause to ponder our past-present scriptings and our present-future rescriptings. And we need to keep asking and answering feminist communication questions about culture in a time when the world is getting transnationally bigger and when our own feminist and queer communal affiliations are becoming more and more important. And so the fight that I do want to pick is with the work of Foss and Griffin, and it's not a mean fight. But what I find so beautiful about their work around ressourcement is that it comes from the inspiration of Starhawk, and it comes from this idea of a woman who tries something different to get her message across, and that happened through performance, and that happened through activism, and rhetoricians took that moment and have used it as a way to rethink a way to rhetorically engage the other. And I want to bring that back out of rhetoric and back into performance studies to remind everyone that that was a performance moment. And in performance studies, we can use that ourselves to rethink our ways into a queer and into a more culturally diverse future. Thank you.
Those of you who know Brenda J. know she's never wrong. And so when she told you at the beginning the last speaker has a tough job, she was right. I had developed some ideas I was going to share in advance of coming to this program, but I don't want to miss being part of this conversation and what's happening here and the benefits that it's having for my own thinking. So I'm going to be perhaps a little less articulate, but definitely more present with you, and just think aloud about what we've heard and what I think is really important about it. First of all, I think Celeste's definition I might not completely accept as a definition of feminism, because you got that fem part you still got to deal with. But I take your idea and I take it very seriously, and I think it connects with this theme that's emerging from this whole panel, which is intersectionality. I've always defined feminism as a commitment to the value of women and their lives, their work, their priorities, etc., etc. And I've always defined feminism as inseparable from a commitment to that, to valuing all life forms. I don't think that you can pick one and say, okay, I'm going to support women, but to hell with the gays, or I'm going to support gays, but I can't deal with people who are of a different color. It doesn't work that way. The oppressions are so interlinked. So I think that there is this larger project of liberation, of recognition, of valuing. And I think the piece of it, and maybe that's what you meant, Celeste, the piece of it that's feminism is paying attention to women and not ever letting that go off the table. But it can't ever be just that. And in that sense, yes, feminism is always about me and about you and about each of us. But it's never just about that, because the minute it is, it doesn't work. So that's the first thing that I see kind of working here. The second idea that seems to me to run across this panel that is I think very important for us to pay attention to is this assessment of where we are. Everybody has said we've made a lot of progress, and my gosh, have we ever. You comment on the visual difference here. You think about your departments, but also important differences. I remember years ago, I think I'd already written the first edition of Gendered Lives, but I was writing a book on interpersonal, a textbook. And in one section, I was writing about some gender differences. And I got back reviewers who said, this isn't a gender book. So in interpersonal relationships, I was to assume gender doesn't exist. Okay, that review would never come to me today, and that's important as a marker of change, because there was a point where feminist scholarship and gender scholarship was in its own little ghettoed area. Okay, now it's understood as mainstream, and nobody lifts an eyebrow when Cindy talks about some gender issues in her public speaking book and when people talk about it in organizational. That's a huge move for feminist and gender scholarship, and it's one that particularly excites me, because I think as long as you stay on the periphery, you aren't really in the game. And so that's been a tremendous move. And there have been many others, an incredible amount of theorizing from standpoint theory and other theories that help us understand how to read women's lives and how to at least begin thinking about this provocative, difficult, and absolutely necessary question of intersectionality, because it's not just women's lives, ever. And at the same time, as everyone on the panel, I think, acknowledges, it's not quitting time yet. There's still some things to be done here, and I think they're very important. Some of them are issues that are still on the table and we haven't resolved. Some are new issues that come about because the society keeps evolving, and as you learn knowledge and change things in one way, new issues crop up. So let me just name a couple that I hope we'll be dealing with. One that has not been resolved is the objectification of women. It has not only not been resolved, it is at a level that is just, it's astounding to me. The things that discomforted us in the 80s are boring now, What we thought was objectification, I would welcome back, in a sense. It's kind of like after so many years of Bush, you said, Reagan wasn't so bad, this is really changing, and the really sinister part of it to me is not just the objectification, but the selling that to women as power. And it is the cheapest, most transient form of power women will ever have. So that's going on, and it's really scary to me that we haven't been able to do much about that. Another issue that hasn't been resolved, in my opinion, and in fact, I think in some ways it's old, in some ways it's new, borrowed and blue, I don't know. But inequity in home life. That one is still on the table, and I say it's old in one sense because some of us were fighting that battle in the 70s and 80s. It's new in a sense that there are more people trying to work that out, more people in dual career families and so forth. And so in that sense, it's taken on another kind of an urgency, I think. But it is definitely an issue. And to go back to Celeste's point about caring, we've got to figure out how to care for our families and care for the two parents in them when they are two-parent families. And that means, whatever else it means some kind of equity. You don't exploit somebody you love. It's that simple. And it's still going on, folks. So I think that issue is still there. The other issue I'd really like us to tune into, and I hope it will happen in our conversation, is one Cerise raised that I think is tremendously important, and that is the fluidity of identity and how much it moves along. You gave the terrific example of a number of black women who get more educated, more feminist, and then there are questions of, can I marry a straight black man? Those sorts of things. And what does that mean about my femininity if I can't? And I think that's a wonderful example of an issue we need to deal with, the fluidity. And I want to give you a couple of others that immediately came to my mind as I was thinking over your example. I don't think it's just about race. Think about age. What it means to me to be a woman today in my 50s is very different than what it meant to me in my 20s. There are all kinds of ways in which I have to renegotiate my femininity. And by the way, to take care of that man problem, Celeste, I've got my man problem. And my man, he's renegotiating it too. What it means to him to be masculine is different than it was when he was in his 20s. And I think we can bring that one in as kind of a gender issue. But what does it mean? And we haven't even been given the tools to articulate and name the struggles that we're dealing with there. What about ability and disability? How do you be really feminine when you have trouble walking? Or other kinds of disabilities that will happen to many of us during our lifetimes. Okay, how do we negotiate that and even have a language for thinking about it? Sexuality is another issue. That if anything's fluid, it's sexuality. What happens when someone who has been living as and identifying as straight for much of her life becomes trans or lesbian or something else that perhaps has not yet been named? And where is femininity in that? Okay. So that question arises for me. And then I think about relationship issues. It's some of both my studies of standpoint theory with lesbianism and some of my close friends who are lesbian have made me very aware of how much my sense of my femininity is linked to being with a man. What happens if he leaves? He dies. Things that are going to happen to many of us and so forth. So I think that relational component of our identity as gendered is very important. And we haven't even begun to talk about that. So I think, to me, those are some of the challenging but really exciting issues to go forward with in the years ahead. I'm confident that we can make enormous progress with them, given what we have done to date. It is a different world we're looking at than we were looking at 30 years ago. I hope I'm around in 30 years to see what it looks like then. But I will stop here for now.
Thank you very much. And time now for I want to start. Are there questions that you have of one another? And then bring our audience into the conversation. So I wanted to give us, our distinguished presenters, a chance to unpack. So we would love to hear from you if you have questions. Yes.
I wanted to ask the panel, while we're trying to focus on intersectionality, whether it be transnational versus national, social versus solitary, or what have you, how do we study it in a way that we don't privilege one part of the intersectionality over the other and force a dichotomy?
I think we begin by making sure we're asking ourselves that question, that we're aware of what we're doing in the first place. And I also think, especially if you're talking primarily about research, we probably in a particular project will be highlighting one facet more than another. So I think maybe even thinking of it in that way, that I'm doing a project on Latinas in a certain context, right? And so I'm especially interested in the intersections of their gender and their ethnicity, and I'm going to be mindful of whatever else may seem to matter to them or whatever else I, going into the project, am assuming will matter. So let's say these are service workers, and let's say many of them are immigrants. So those become other pieces that I want to be aware of and invite them to talk about. And so as I'm gathering my data, as I'm analyzing it and so forth, I do want to be aware that I'm foregrounding, but I'm also factoring in some of these other kinds of issues, would be one way. And so I return to my original response, which is mindfulness of what you're doing in the first place. And what question are you seeking to understand? But as you're trying to understand it, not then limiting yourself, or not then kind of reducing your reporting and analysis to saying 20% of them were from Puerto Rico, so that kind of thing.
Let me give you a good example of how this can be done. And I think the point is not to take this as a model, but here's one good example. And it's a chapter that Brenda wrote for a book Steve Duck and I co-edited called Composing Relationships. And she wrote Communication at Wake Company?
Waco.
WEIGHCO. Yeah. And in many ways, you centered race ethnicity in terms of how that worked in the organization and how it was a basis for various kinds of discriminatory sorts of treatment. It was the kinds of discrimination that is not the overt horrible stuff, but it's just dreadful assumptions about someone because of your color or what have you, and then acting on those as if that's normal. But it's an artfully done chapter where you leave understanding how race figures in, race ethnicity figures in, but you also understand where gender's coming in. And so that, I think I would say you did exactly what you're advising people to do, which is you centered one thing, but the other stuff wasn't lost. Somebody else will come along and center gender, but race and ethnicity don't have to be lost. Neither does class. And I think if you get enough of those facets, then the whole may come closer to working with our understandings.
I'm curious as to where religion fits into intersectionality, because religion has so many prescriptions for what's appropriate, ways to embody gender and sexuality and so many other things that make us who we are.
Yes.
So going back to if I was studying Latina experiences, if I have any sense of, for humans in general, what facets of social identity are particularly salient at any given point, and if I have any understanding of what happens for many people of Latin descent in terms of religion, and let's say I was in an area where clearly that mattered in particular ways, let's say for Catholicism, not trying to generalize at all, but having a sense of what might be so, then I would be mindful of that, and also in terms of how I'm trying to gain understanding, asking questions, trying to get at the issues. So yeah, religion definitely matters, and if none of us stated that as one of the things, I think all of my panelists would agree, we see that as extremely significant. And with all of these facets of identity, they matter whether or not you, the individual, see them as specifically relevant. So that with religion, it's not just my religious identification and whether or not that's implicated who I am. It can also be, well, I'm not that religious. And even being aware of that, right, says that aspect of identity is very pivotal.
If I could something that stirred in me when you answered that question is, I think one of the things that we need to do more of is collaborative work to promote the understandings of intersectionality, because in the religion example is one, because working on genetics, I would never have raise the question of religion. But I work with Tina Harris, who's an African American woman, and for her, the religion was like, "What? You're not dealing with this?" And of course, that just would not have come to mind on my own. But in working with her, we pool, and in some ways, maybe a thing to think about intersectionality is that it is also relational, and so that collaboration is, I think, a good way to work on intersectionality because none of us can embody all the knowledge of every place. So.
I have a question for Julia. If I remember, it was the piece that you did on the original panel, and you talked about that maybe we should move from a focus on gender to a focus on oppression. And that was the first time I'd ever heard anybody suggest that, and my initial response was, what? And then as I started thinking about it, I thought, oh yeah, I think that's a great idea. So now it seems like maybe you've gone back a little bit and you're featuring women in your definition again, or how do you reconcile those two? And am I remembering it correctly?
No, you remembered it wrong. I'm absolutely consistent. No, actually, maybe I emphasized it a little differently the two times. I think, and I don't remember that panel as well as maybe I should and wish I did right now. But I've always thought feminism was more about women because that's from the root term feminine. But I've always seen it as inseparable from looking at other oppressions. And in that sense, I mean, I can't give a definition that just stops with valuing women and their activities and so forth and so on. I have to add that next line, and it's inseparable from valuing other living beings. And so, for me, they don't feel inconsistent, but I don't know. Maybe I said them a little bit differently. No, I mean, I think you're still dealing with oppression centrally. If we could get rid of oppression entirely, as in what Celeste theory will lead us to, if we could do that, we wouldn't have to deal with feminism and homophobia and various other things. Yeah.
I had a question about, again, with intersectionality, and particularly in rhetorical studies, but in com studies generally, the feminist scholarship raises questions of intersectionality and invites the reader and the field to be more conscious or attentive to that. But at the same time, there seems to be very little place for really engaging intersectionality beyond just what you were saying, Brenda, about naming it and recognizing it. So I wanted to hear from you all as we look to the future, especially in globalization and all of these different goals, to what degree does making intersectionality a workable approach to feminist scholarship and communication require maybe going back over what has become feminist canons?
What are the canons?
Well, can I try to jump in and answer that? And this will also dovetail with the first question about how do you really, I mean, if I rephrase the question a little bit, like how do you operationalize intersectionality? And my answer to that is to get away from an academic language, first of all. And so if you're talking about black women, straight black women, what are the words that are used to name them? So whenever I talk about queer Latino men, I use joto now, J-O-T-O, 4 letters. Not queer Latino men, which the language is less clunky, and whenever you realize what joto is, then you have to do the work of imagining that subjectivity without all those adjectives on that noun. And so in your question about getting back to a canon of feminism, which for me is mixed in with activism as well. My answer for that would be really listening to the people that you're studying. And I think that we're trained and that we have an arrogance whenever we study that we know more than the participants. And think about the relationship we have with our mothers or our grandmothers and their form of feminism. And, oh, that's not feminism, or she doesn't get it, or being very dismissive about a local, an operational, being very dismissive about a way in the world. And I think it really does come down to using the words and using the direction of the people that you're studying about and making it studying with. And I think that gets a little bit at it.
Yeah, to kind of draw on that, yesterday we did a pre-conference on feminism and intersectionality, and it was superb, really engaging, really wonderful. And part of it was going back to many of the pieces that introduced us all to intersectionality. And one of the pieces was Marcia Houston's text. I think it was what distinguishes feminist communication. I can't remember. Anyway, one of the key pieces that I took from that was that yes, intersectionality means recognizing how these differences interact, but secondly, it means recognizing how those differences interact for those people, and really embracing and examining the meaning systems that emerge from the group for those communication patterns, for those behaviors, for those engagements. And that was really significant for me. That it's also about embracing and recognizing and validating the meaning systems and how people make meaning.
One thing that seems missing from our conversation, I just realized, is our pedagogy, our teaching. And a place where, as I reflect on where I feel most successful in these issues in terms of raising consciousness, which feminism strives to do, in terms of helping people feel more empowered, is in my teaching is introducing pieces or having students read as well as having students reflect upon their own embodiments of social identities. And there's one piece in particular, I cannot pull the actual citation, but it's and some of you may know it, it's in a reader, and it's written by a white gay male in Appalachia who resists even going to college and who has to deal, because of various identity, as you can imagine, just from those descriptors. But he actually has chosen to write, he's the graduation speech for his, whatever the department he was in. They did their separate graduation. And so his essay it combines his graduation speech with experiences that he had throughout his lives, and it's beautiful. And when students read that, they so get the contradictions, the conflicts, the tensions in terms of intersectionality. And I often have students write reflection papers in which they talk through and feel through, because emotions, I tell them emotions matter, talk through and feel through what it's like to be them and how contextual and how fluid their senses of selves are. So I think another key piece to both of those questions is thinking about what we're doing in our teaching and in other situations where we're helping others get in touch with how these things operate in their lives and how significant they are and how all of us struggle, right? We're negotiating, and depending on the context, we're aware in different ways of what part of me, what facet seems to be especially significant here. And so those are the kinds of things we can also, I think, get at in our research.
I just wanted to ask, I believe that you brought up this idea of the objectification of women and how that is actually being sold to women as a power, in terms of making it more like a commodity or a commodification of the sexual identity. And with the predominance or more increasing predominance, even in a global context, of the market forces or the kind of capitalist approach of how that is generating so much revenue, is it a runaway train in terms of feminism? Can you recapture that in a way that empowers women to see that that is not necessarily liberation or actual freedom more than it is oppression, I guess.
Well, if we think we can keep global climate change from being a runaway train that's going to destroy us all, I think maybe we could do something here. And I don't mean that as a dismissive response to you. I mean, I see global climate change has gone so far that it's hard to rein it back in. I think we can do something, and I think we must. How much and how much impact it will have, I don't think we can know at the start. But I'm not going to not try because I'm not sure how much we can do. And I'll pull on something that Brenda was saying a minute ago. One of the places where I'm more able to make it happen in terms of a different consciousness about this is in my classrooms. When you really take students through some of the ads and help them learn to see what's going on in those ads, what they're being sold, that it's a false bill of goods, they begin to get it. And I think that's just training them and being good critics of media. They begin to get it, and they talk with their friends and so forth, so that happens. But they also begin to see some of the nastier undercurrents of this consumer ideology as it's foisted on women. And those nastier undercurrents are extraordinarily racist, classist, and centered on male gaze. They begin to realize that the model of beauty and sexiness and so forth is still either white, or if it's of color, it's very exotic. So we've got some racism going on there for sure. And you look at the kinds of prices that are required to get everything you need to try and even get in the game and all. It is so incredibly classist on that level. I mean, there are very few people that can afford all of the products and services required to get yourself looking presentable. But we all strive for it. So beginning to get them to see that, I think it's incredibly important. And then seeing how it is through that male gaze, but how women are taught, or straight male gaze, but women are taught to see themselves through that gaze. If I can get them to get that point, we're going to win. That's the key point. If they can see they've adopted that gaze, it tends to be kind of a perspective changer for them. I don't know, what do others say here?
Well, this is exactly the problem why I've changed completely how I think about human beings and why I want to focus on emotion. And because I think that maybe our intellectualizing of ideology as meaning states and so forth, while what the market system works on is our emotions, is why we haven't done as much. And it's not that I don't disagree with Julia that in our classrooms we are able to make them see. Are we able to make them feel differently and to understand themselves as feeling creatures? Because as feeling creatures, we are all susceptible to the appeal of, Dallas and Dynasty and my era and whatever it is now, right? I mean, and to those ads, right?
Dallas.
Sex in the City.
Dallas, Texas.
But people, media critics routinely will say, they'll routinely say, well, I know this stuff is ideologically wrong, but I still enjoy it. And we've been saying that for 20 years. And so it's not about the ideology. We can all understand the ideology and still be prey to the circuit of emotions that it directs us to. And so what I think one of the ways to deal with this is to begin to understand what we feel. And as I say, I think it's about expanding our emotional sense. So that, yes, I feel right in this moment the lust that this induces in me, the dominance perspective. This is going to make me be more dominant, and that's a very appealing emotion. And I have to admit it's an appealing emotion to get over it, or whatever other thing, the hamburger that makes you hungry, whatever, and that you have to say, okay, I recognize in myself the pleasure of this emotion that's being aroused. Before you can say, now what emotions do I want to feel? Okay? And to recognize the emotion that I have right now is right now But there are certain kinds of, and I would say they're social emotions, that have more endurance and more sharing power, and that are ultimately stronger emotions, and they're the emotions I want to live with. Because right now, our critique of the ideology doesn't give people a way to live. It gives us a rejection of what there is. But if we begin to say, okay, there are really easy ways, not easy, but there are imaginable, doable ways to instead spend my time in joy with other people, instead of spend my time being aroused. I mean, I just can't watch TV anymore. I don't have a TV anymore, and I don't do that as some kind of ideological stance. It stopped speaking to my heart once I spent more time emotionally with other things. And so I think that's one way of subverting the mass media's drive, is once people feel the strength of these other emotions more, those emotions won't have the power to redirect bodies the way they are now. So that's a thought.
For me, if I may add, it starts with a self-interrogation of things that are seemingly simple, easy, and everyday. And so I was joking with a colleague when I was rehearsing this morning, when I was in my PJs, my hair was wrapped up, and I said, I'm going to show up just like that as a political statement, because I'm no more professional in my expensive blazer or nice blouse. But at the same time, now that I'm taping this, I'm glad I did. But I recognize that I'm still a negotiator, accepting part of that justification. I paid for the blazer. Yes. Just so I can look professional. Instead of my cheap little PJs, which are equally cute. But at the same time, in order for that space, I really have to ask myself, how much every day am I complicit in what I'm really being, as much as I'm receiving? Mm-hmm. Same thing with on a plane, I'm reading a Glamour magazine, I think I look fine, but now all of a sudden I'm thinking maybe I should start doing some preventative, wrinkle stuff, because I don't want wrinkles 40 years from now. It's like, I thought I looked fine before I read this magazine. What I think I need to spend $40 on some wrinkles I don't even have. Right. And so for me, it's just, and it's so funny how I still do this, is no matter how much I read, no matter how much research I write, no matter how much I teach, I'm still vulnerable to those same messages, and I'm still vulnerable to that commodification of my own self, to a point where I participate in, and we all do, in ways where we decide how much you want to do. So just for me, keeping that in the front of my mind and interrogating myself to do that, and then to have that conversation with others and with my own students, is a really good way for me to just keep that check within my own self.
One issue that this turn in the conversation brings up that I don't think we have discussed explicitly, that I would add to our agenda, is the idea of helping, especially women, since we're talking feminism, heighten the awareness of ourselves as sexualized beings. That I think when feminism turns to sex, right, it typically is, and justifiably so, regarding things like sexual harassment, regarding things like clitoridectomies, and all of that is really, really important. But very rarely am I aware of, in our literature in comm studies, as well as in our teaching and so forth, of acknowledging that we're sexualized beings. So when you talk about feeling and emotion and the idea of pleasure, the idea of being aroused, the idea of lust and so forth, I think that if we haven't addressed it head on, then what can happen is by default, we're learning, we're indoctrinating, we're socializing, we're reifying certain perspectives, and again, in particular on women as sexual beings.
There's one more question in the back, and then we...
I'm fascinated by this idea of feminism as a sort of embodied knowledge, and like from the roots of feminism, this idea of activism as a part of the academic agenda. And so I'm curious as to where, personally, where do you find yourself as a scholar and activist? Is it in your teaching? Is it in your research? Like my experience has been like physically being a body out in a space of resistance is different than writing about that or even teaching about that. So I'm curious if that's changed over the past 20 years, if you've changed your views on that.
But one of the things I think is that you do change over time, and that's kind of theme here, right? And so when I was younger and had more energy than I have now, I thought of activism as something I had to be doing like full tilt, like either you're in it or you're not.
And so I would do these like binges, right? And then I'd be exhausted and I'd go away. And now what I do is I do little things. Like, so I don't binge. So I do a project with a community organization for a while, which is like a little binge. But I don't see that as something I have to like commit my life to forever, right? It's like I'm doing some good work here now. And then I'll do like something even, like if I'm really tired and I've had 2 really bad years at the academy and I'm done with doing all the things I was doing then that made them bad years. But in that time, I didn't have as much energy. And so like for environmentalism, the only thing I could find to do is we have a land trust and they need land surveys. So I'd go out and do land surveys, which was like what I could handle right then, because like I didn't have to talk to anybody, I just walked around, saw that the maps were right. So I think one of the things that you can do is that different times you can do different things, and there isn't just one model for all your life. So there will be times in your life when you can do a whole lot, like 20 hours a day, intense, etc., and that's wonderful. And there's other times when all you can do is show up at the Arch for the, equal pay rally. And, let yourself have those differences in different times. And every one of those will inform you along the way in different ways. It's all surprise and, so it does inform your research and the rest of your life. You don't know how.